The room didn't go silent all at once. It happened in layers, like sound being pulled out of the air. Every adult stopped moving before anyone spoke. And that's when I knew my name wasn't supposed to be on that file. If stories like this make you pause and feel something tightening in your chest, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss what unfolds next. I hadn't gone looking for anything that day. I was just trying to return a misplaced folder I'd found while cleaning out an old storage room near the library. The school rarely used that space anymore, and most of what was inside felt forgotten. Dusty boxes, outdated posters, stacks of papers from years ago. One folder stood out because it looked newer than the rest. It had no label on the front, just a worn tab on the side. When I opened it, I froze. My name was printed clearly across the first page, typed neatly, unmistakable. I stared at it for a long time, trying to remember ever being told about a file like this. I couldn't. I had never been in trouble. I followed rules. I kept my head down. Whatever that folder was, it didn't match the version of me I knew. I told myself there had to be an explanation, so I did the logical thing. I took it to the office. The walk there felt longer than usual. Every step echoed louder than it should have. When I reached the counter, the secretary looked up with a practiced smile that faded the moment she saw what I was holding. Her eyes flicked to the folder, then to my face, then past me toward the principal's office. She didn't ask why I had it. She didn't ask where I found it. She just stood up and said she needed a moment. That's when the silence started. Teachers stopped talking. Phones stopped ringing. Someone closed a door softly, like they were trying not to be noticed. The principal came out, took one look at the folder, and asked me to sit down. No explanation, no reassurance, just that. I sat. The chair felt colder than usual. My hands were shaking slightly, and I kept them folded in my lap so no one would notice. I watched as the principal and the secretary spoke in low voices. Their expressions were tight, careful, like people trying not to say the wrong thing. Finally, the principal turned to me and asked where I found the folder. I told the truth. He nodded slowly, as if confirming something he already knew. Then he said something that didn't make sense at the time. This shouldn't have been there. That was it. No apology, no explanation, just that. They took the folder from me and told me I could return to class. I stood up, unsure if I was dismissed or being sent away. No one met my eyes as I walked out. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I couldn't focus. Every whisper felt like it was about me. Every glance from a teacher felt heavier than before. When I got home, I asked my parents if they knew anything about a school file with my name on it. The reaction was immediate, too immediate. My mother went quiet. My father asked why I was asking, not what it was about, not what I'd seen, why I was asking. I told them what happened. They exchanged a look I'd never seen before. Not fear exactly, something closer to resignation. My father said we'd talk about it later. We didn't. Days passed, then weeks. No one mentioned the folder again. At school, nothing seemed different on the surface, but I felt watched, observed. Teachers treated me politely, carefully, like they were afraid of saying the wrong thing. I started noticing small things, comments that stopped halfway, meetings I wasn't invited to anymore, decisions made without my input. It felt like I had stepped into a version of the school where everyone knew something about me that I didn't. The betrayal didn't hit all at once. It arrived slowly, through realization. Someone had created that file. Someone had decided I needed to be documented, and someone made sure I never knew. I began paying attention, listening, watching reactions instead of words. Patterns started to form. A teacher who avoided me now had once praised me too openly. A counselor who suddenly insisted on check-ins had previously dismissed my concerns. This wasn't about behavior. It was about control. I remembered moments from years earlier, times when adults spoke for me, corrected my tone, reframed my actions, times when I'd been labeled sensitive or difficult without ever being asked how I felt. The file wasn't the beginning, it was the record. One afternoon, I was called into the office again. This time, the counselor was there too. They asked careful questions about my feelings, my home life, my stress levels. Every question felt rehearsed. I answered honestly. They nodded too much. When I asked directly what the file was about, the room went quiet again. The counselor said it was procedural. The principal said it was for support. Neither explained why I'd never been told. I realized then that the silence wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. Someone had decided I didn't need to know what had been decided about me. That night, I told my parents I wanted answers. My mother cried. My father finally admitted that years ago, a complaint had been made, not by me, about me, by someone who claimed they were helping, a relative, someone trusted. They had framed concern as protection, interpretation as fact, and the school had accepted it without ever asking me. The betrayal settled deep. But so did something else. Resolve. Because now I knew where the silence came from, and once you know that, you can start deciding what to do with it. I didn't confront anyone. Not yet. I waited. And as I waited, I learned exactly how much damage quiet decisions can do when they go unchallenged, and how much power returns when the person they were made about finally understands what was taken from them, setting the stage for something that wouldn't look like anger or accusation, but like patience turning into inevitability as the truth continued to press forward, uninvited and unstoppable. Once I understood that the file existed because someone else had spoken for me, everything around me began to feel different. Hallways I had walked through for years suddenly felt narrower. Conversations felt staged. Even compliments felt like they came with conditions. I didn't rush to expose anything. I didn't argue. I didn't demand meetings. I did something far more unsettling. I observed. I started paying attention to who decided things and how, who spoke first in meetings, who summarized situations before anyone else could add nuance, who framed events in a way that left no room for contradiction. It became clear that the relative who had filed the complaint years ago had not done it once. They had done it repeatedly, subtly over time. Each concern framed as protection, each interpretation offered as insight. They had built a narrative about me long before I had the words to challenge it. The school hadn't created the file out of malice, they had accepted it out of convenience. That realization hurt more than anger ever could. I noticed teachers referencing background context when speaking about me, counselors checking boxes that felt pre-decided, authority without hostility, but also without curiosity. I wasn't being punished, I was being managed. At home, my parents struggled with guilt. They admitted they had trusted the relative completely, that they believed the concern was sincere, that questioning it would have felt ungrateful. Silence, I learned, often starts as politeness. The relative in question began contacting us more frequently once they realized something was wrong. Their tone was calm, reassuring, almost proud. They spoke about how difficult I had been as a child, how sensitive, how easily overwhelmed. They never asked how I felt now. They never asked what I wanted. I stopped responding to them directly. Instead, I asked my parents for something simple: access. Not to the file itself, not to the people who wrote it, access to decisions. I wanted to be present when plans about me were discussed. I wanted to speak when my future was framed. I wanted my words included in the record, not interpreted through someone else. The school hesitated at first. Then they agreed. That alone shifted everything. The next meeting felt tense. I sat at the table with adults who had been discussing me for years without ever hearing my voice. They were polite, careful, almost apologetic. I didn't accuse anyone. I asked questions. Why was this concern recorded but never shared with me? Why were assumptions documented as conclusions? Why had no one thought to verify them? The answers were slow, fragmented, defensive. But they were answers. As those answers accumulated, something changed, not in policy, but in posture. Teachers leaned back instead of forward. Counselors paused instead of filling silence. They were listening. The relative was invited to join one of these meetings. They declined. That told me everything. Their power had relied on absence, on me not being in the room. Now that I was, they no longer controlled the narrative. They tried reaching out again afterward, framing the meetings as unnecessary stress, suggesting I let adults handle things. I didn't respond. Weeks passed, and notes in the file were quietly revised. Language softened. Some conclusions were classified as third-party observations. The file wasn't erased, but it lost authority. The revenge wasn't dramatic. No confrontation, no exposure. It was correction. The relative's influence faded as people realized how much had been taken on trust alone, without evidence, without consent, without my voice. One afternoon, a teacher apologized, not directly, but sincerely. They said they wished they had asked more questions earlier. I nodded. I accepted it, because the goal wasn't punishment, it was restoration. I began noticing something else too. The relative avoided mentioning my name. When they did, it was cautiously, without interpretation, without judgment. They had learned the same lesson the school had, that narratives collapse when the subject speaks. The silence that once protected their influence now worked against them. They couldn't defend what they no longer controlled. At home, my parents changed too. They stopped deferring. They asked me what I wanted. They included me in decisions that had once been made for my own good. Trust, I realized, doesn't return all at once. It rebuilds through behavior. The final shift came quietly, during an end-of-term review. The counselor summarized my progress and said something unexpected. We're adjusting our approach based on direct feedback. Direct. Not reported, not interpreted, not filtered. Mine. I walked out of that office feeling lighter than I had in years. Not because everything was fixed, but because it was finally honest. The relative never apologized. They didn't need to. They lost something far more important: credibility. And as their voice faded from decisions that shaped my life, I understood that revenge doesn't always involve taking something back by force. Sometimes it simply removes the ability to take anything again. What remained was a quiet understanding among everyone involved that the silence surrounding my name had been broken, not by anger, but by presence. And that presence would continue shaping every choice moving forward, as the consequences of years of unchecked influence continued to unfold naturally, without resistance, without drama, leading into a final realization that would make it impossible for the past to repeat itself again. That realization didn't arrive with relief. It arrived with weight. The kind that settles into your chest when you understand how long something has shaped you without your consent. I began to recognize how often I had second-guessed myself, how many times I had adjusted my tone or softened my opinions because I had been subtly taught that my perspective was unreliable. That belief hadn't been mine. It had been handed to me. Once I saw that, I stopped carrying it. At school, the change in how I was treated became more consistent. Teachers addressed me directly instead of speaking around me. When concerns came up, they asked questions instead of making statements. The difference was small, but it changed everything. I no longer felt like a subject being monitored. I felt like a person being respected. The relative who had started all of this stayed distant. When they did appear, their presence felt muted. They spoke less, When they did speak, they were careful, almost rehearsed. They avoided specifics, avoided conclusions. They had learned that confidence without consent no longer worked. One afternoon, I overheard them talking to someone else. They were explaining how things had changed and how they were giving me space to grow. The words were carefully chosen, polite. But what struck me most was what they didn't say. They didn't claim responsibility anymore. That silence was telling. I realized then that they weren't ashamed of what they'd done. They were afraid of being questioned again, afraid of scrutiny, afraid of having their intentions examined the way mine finally had been. That fear was its own kind of justice. My parents continued adjusting too. They stopped treating the past as something too delicate to revisit. We talked openly about what had happened, about why they believed the relative at the time, and about how easily concern can turn into control when no one checks it. They apologized, not for trusting someone they loved, but for not trusting me sooner. I forgave them, because they learned. The most unexpected change came from within me. I stopped shrinking. I stopped over-explaining. I stopped feeling like I needed permission to exist confidently. I learned that silence can be protective when chosen, but damaging when imposed. I chose differently now. During a school event later that year, I was asked to speak briefly, nothing dramatic, just a reflection on growth and learning. As I stood there, I noticed something that made my heart steady. The adults who once spoke for me were listening. The relative was there too, sitting quietly, watching. I spoke calmly, honestly. I didn't reference the file. I didn't accuse anyone. I spoke about the importance of being heard, of how assumptions can follow someone for years if they're never challenged. The room stayed silent afterward, but it was a different kind of silence. It was reflective, respectful. I stepped down feeling something close to peace. Later, a counselor told me my words had changed how they thought about background documentation. They said they would approach it differently moving forward. That was when I understood the full shape of the revenge. It wasn't about undoing what had been done to me. It was about making sure it didn't happen to anyone else. The file still existed somewhere, I knew that, but it no longer defined me. It had become just one perspective among many, stripped of authority, contextualized by truth. The relative eventually approached me months later, not to apologize, but to acknowledge that they might have been overprotective. I thanked them for saying that, and I didn't invite further conversation because closure doesn't always require agreement. Sometimes it requires distance. As the year came to an end, the weight I'd been carrying for so long finally lifted, not because everything was resolved perfectly, but because the imbalance had been corrected. The people who once decided for me had learned to ask. The person who once spoke for me had learned to step back. And I had learned that my voice didn't need to be loud to be effective. It only needed to be present. Looking back, I realized the most powerful moment in this entire story wasn't when the room went silent at the office. It was when that silence stopped being used against me. When silence became something I chose. The final confirmation came quietly during a routine review. The counselor looked at me and said, "We want to hear from you first." First. That word mattered because it meant the story had changed, the narrative had shifted, and the cycle that began years ago with one unchecked voice had finally been broken. What remained now was a calm certainty that the past would not repeat itself, not because people were afraid, but because they were aware, and that awareness carried forward, shaping every interaction, every decision, every pause, leading inevitably toward an ending that didn't need confrontation to feel complete, because the justice had already been done, quietly, thoroughly, and in a way that could never be undone. Life didn't suddenly feel perfect after that. It felt clearer, and clarity, I learned, is far more powerful than comfort. When you see the truth of how something shaped you, you stop bending yourself around it. You move forward with intention instead of fear. The school year ended without incident, no dramatic meetings, no formal apologies, but the atmosphere had changed. Decisions were now transparent, conversations were open. When concerns arose, they were addressed directly with the person involved, not passed around quietly behind closed doors. That alone felt revolutionary. The relative who had once defined my narrative faded into the background of my life, not because they were pushed out, but because they no longer had a role to play. Influence requires access, and access requires trust. Once trust is questioned, influence dissolves naturally. I didn't avoid them, I simply didn't defer to them anymore, and that was enough. At home, my parents continued to include me in decisions that affected me. They asked questions instead of making assumptions. They listened without interrupting. The shift was subtle but permanent. It rebuilt something that had been strained without anyone realizing it had been damaged. One evening, my mother admitted something quietly. She said that for years she had felt uneasy about how often others described me instead of asking me. She said she thought silence was keeping the peace. Now she understood that silence had only protected imbalance. That realization brought us closer. As time passed, the file itself stopped mattering. I no longer wondered what it said. I no longer needed to see it. It had lost its power the moment it stopped being secret. What mattered was that people had learned to question narratives instead of accepting them automatically. I carried that lesson with me everywhere. In new spaces with new people, I paid attention to who was spoken about instead of spoken with. I noticed how easily assumptions form and how rarely they're challenged. And when I saw it happening, I spoke up, not angrily, not dramatically, but clearly. Clarity, I learned, is disarming. The final moment of closure came unexpectedly during a casual visit back to the school months later. I was there for something unrelated, passing through familiar hallways that no longer felt heavy. I ran into the principal, who smiled and asked how I was doing. Then they said something simple. "I'm glad you brought that folder in." Not because of what it contained, but because of what it revealed. I thanked them, and as I walked away, I understood something important. Sometimes the most powerful act isn't uncovering a secret, it's refusing to carry it alone once you know it exists. The silence that had once surrounded my name was gone. In its place was understanding, accountability, and respect. The betrayal hadn't disappeared, it had been transformed into awareness, into growth, into a boundary that would not be crossed again. And the revenge? It wasn't loud, it wasn't cruel, it was the permanent loss of unchecked influence. The person who once shaped my story without my consent would never do so again, not to me, not to anyone, because the system that allowed it had changed. That is how cycles end, not with destruction, but with clarity. And as I stepped fully into a future shaped by my own voice, I knew that the silence that once felt dangerous had become something else entirely, not a weapon, not a shield, but a space where truth could no longer hide, and where my story would always begin with me.